Before there were walls, before stone was shaped by intention or stacked with care, there was only the desert. It stretched outward in every direction, vast and unbroken, a surface shaped not by human hands but by wind, heat, and time. The land rose and fell gently, dunes forming slow waves of sand that shifted almost imperceptibly from season to season. In some places, the sand thinned, revealing pale rock beneath scarred, cracked, and polished smooth by centuries of sun and dust. The desert did not announce itself loudly. It did not roar or crash. It breathed. During the day, heat settled heavily over the land. The sun climbed steadily into a sky emptied of clouds, its light flattening color and shadow until the world seemed reduced to shades of gold, bone, and pale brown. The air shimmered above the ground, bending distance into illusion. Faraway rocks appeared to float. Hills dissolved into mirages, then returned again when the wind shifted. Even sound seemed hesitant here, swallowed quickly by the open space. At night, the desert changed its voice. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the heat slowly loosened its grip. Stone released warmth in gentle waves, and the air cooled enough for breath to feel fuller, calmer. Shadows stretched long across the sand, then faded entirely as darkness settled in. Above, the sky opened wide, revealing stars in numbers unseen elsewhere, sharp points of white and silver scattered across an endless black canopy. The desert was never truly silent. Wind brushed across dunes with a low, steady whisper. Fine grains of sand slid softly down slopes, rearranging the land in movements too small to see but constant nonetheless. Occasionally, a distant call echoed, a bird returning to roost, or the brief cry of an animal moving cautiously through the night. These sounds did not break the quiet. They belonged to it. Early travelers felt this immediately. Those who crossed the desert did so slowly, deliberately. Each step pressed into sand that yielded and shifted beneath, reminding them that nothing here was fixed. The smell of dust clung to skin and fabric. Thirst arrived quietly at first, then grew insistent as hours passed beneath the sun. Water, when found, tasted faintly of minerals and stone, precious beyond measure. Caravans followed narrow, unwritten paths. These routes were not marked by signs or roads, but by memory, by knowledge passed from one traveler to another. A cluster of darker rocks here, a shallow depression where rain sometimes gathered, a lone tree, twisted and stubborn, its roots gripping deep beneath the sand. These landmarks were fragile guides, always at risk of being erased by wind or time. In this landscape, survival was never guaranteed. The desert offered no shelter freely. Shade was rare, food scarcer still. Storms arrived suddenly, walls of sand rising from the horizon and swallowing everything in their path. When the wind howled, it carried grit that stung the skin and filled the eyes, forcing travelers to turn away, to crouch low, to wait. Hours might pass like this, motionless, breath-shallow, listening as the land reshaped itself around them. Yet the desert was not hostile by nature. It was indifferent. Those who learned its rhythms began to understand its quiet generosity. Cool air near the ground at dawn, subtle changes in wind that hinted at approaching weather, the way certain stones retained warmth longer into the night. The desert rewarded patience, observation, and humility. It punished haste and arrogance without malice, simply by continuing to exist as it always had. It was within this balance, between danger and refuge, that the idea of shelter slowly emerged. Not the towering castles of later ages, not monuments meant to be seen from afar, but places that blended into the land, borrowing strength from what already existed. Early settlers did not seek to dominate the desert. They sought to survive alongside it. They studied the cliffs first. Rock faces rose abruptly from the sand in certain regions, their surfaces fractured but strong. From a distance, these cliffs appeared lifeless, but up close they offered narrow ledges, shallow caves, and shaded recesses where the sun's reach weakened. Touching the stone revealed its texture, rough in places, smooth in others, cool beneath the fingers even after long days of heat. Wadis carved faint scars through the land. Dry riverbeds that waited patiently for rain that might come once a year or once a decade. When water did arrive, it moved swiftly, briefly transforming silence into motion before disappearing again into the earth. These channels hinted at hidden systems beneath the surface, paths water remembered, even when the land above seemed barren. The desert held memory, and those who listened could feel it. Even before the first stone was laid, people began to pause in certain places longer than others. They rested near cliffs that blocked the wind. They camped beside rock formations that cast longer shadows at dusk. Over time, these pauses became habits. Habits became routines, and routines planted the earliest roots of permanence. The thought was not spoken aloud at first. It arrived quietly, like the realization that comes while watching the sun rise or the stars turn overhead. If one could remain here, if shelter could be shaped from what the land already offered, then movement might no longer be the only option. Waiting could become a strategy. Endurance could replace escape. The desert, after all, favored those who stayed still. As days passed into weeks and weeks into seasons, the idea of building did not feel like conquest. It felt like listening, like responding carefully to what the land permitted. Stone was not quarried aggressively. It was gathered from fallen fragments, shaped gently, stacked where gravity and balance allowed. Before walls rose, there were lines of shade. Before gates, there were narrow openings angled away from the sun. Before fortresses, there were quiet spaces where heat softened and wind slowed, where breath came easier, and where the desert's vastness felt less overwhelming. This was the beginning, not of war, not of power, but of patience. Long before armies marched and banners flew, long before siege engines and iron weapons, the desert itself shaped the blueprint. It taught that survival depended not on force, but on restraint, that protection did not require visibility, and that the strongest structures were often those that appeared to belong exactly where they stood. The fortress had not yet taken form, but the desert was already preparing it. The decision to remain did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, like the desert itself, gradual, deliberate, shaped by repetition rather than declaration. Those who lingered near the cliffs or rocky rises did so at first for simple reasons. Shade that lasted longer into the morning, stone that held the night's coolness, ground firm enough to rest upon without sinking. But over time, these pauses became moments of study. Eyes traced the land not as travelers passing through, but as listeners learning a language spoken without words. The cliffs revealed themselves patiently. From a distance, they appeared harsh and unyielding, rising sharply from sand and scrub. But as days passed and bodies learned their contours, subtleties emerged. Certain faces caught less sun, remaining cooler even at midday. Crevices funneled wind gently rather than violently. Narrow ledges collected drifting seeds and dust, enough to support small plants whose roots found purchase in cracks invisible from afar. Touch mattered here. Hands pressed against stone, feeling where it crumbled and where it resisted. The rock told its history quietly, layers compressed over time, fractures formed by ancient shifts, surfaces polished smooth by centuries of wind-blown sand. In some places, stone flaked easily, unsuitable for shelter. In others, it stood firm, promising longevity. The desert did not hide its weaknesses. It simply required patience to see them. Wadis, too, became objects of contemplation. Dry for most of the year, they appeared lifeless, mere scars carved through the earth. But those who waited long enough witnessed their transformation. After distant storms, water arrived suddenly, racing along these channels with surprising force, carrying debris, seeds, and life. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished again, leaving behind damp earth and faint traces of green. To build too close was dangerous. To build too far was wasteful. Choosing the right distance became an exercise in restraint and memory. People recalled past floods, subtle marks on rock faces where water once rose. They traced lines left by silt, patterns that only revealed themselves when one stopped moving long enough to notice. These observations were shared quietly, often through gesture rather than speech: a pointing hand, a nod toward higher ground, a stone placed deliberately as a marker. Height was considered carefully. High ground offered visibility, but visibility invited attention. The desert taught that being seen was not always an advantage. From elevated positions, heat struck harder, wind cut more sharply, and silhouettes stood out against the sky. Those who watched caravans from afar noticed how easily movement could be detected against open horizons. In contrast, lower positions, nestled against rock faces or tucked into natural folds of land, offered concealment. Shadows lingered longer. Shapes blended into surrounding stone. From a distance, these places appeared empty, unremarkable, unworthy of notice. This invisibility felt comforting. Not as fear, but as alignment with the desert's nature. The land itself did not announce its resources. It concealed them, revealing only to those who knew where and how to look. To hide was not to retreat. It was to survive. Wind direction mattered. Over days and nights, people watched how air moved across the terrain. In the afternoons, heated air rose, drawing breezes upward along slopes. At night, cooling air descended, flowing gently downward into valleys. Certain locations remained calmer, protected from harsh gusts by the curvature of rock or the angle of terrain. These quiet pockets became places of rest. Here, fires burned more steadily. Smoke rose straight rather than scattering. Voices carried softly, not torn away by wind. The desert seemed less vast when enclosed gently by stone. Sunlight, too, was studied with care. The path of the sun across the sky was predictable, but its effects varied. Walls of rock cast shadows that moved slowly throughout the day, offering brief relief before heat returned. People learned where shadows fell longest at dawn and dusk, when stone absorbed warmth and released it gradually through the night. The desert rewarded this attentiveness. Slowly, certain places began to feel familiar, not just known but trusted. Trust did not come easily here. It was earned through repeated observation, through nights spent listening for shifting sand, through days measured by the movement of light rather than clocks. The idea of permanence began to take root. Not permanence in the sense of ownership or dominance, but continuity. A place where tools could be left without fear of burial by sand, where water, once found, remained accessible, where paths could be remembered rather than rediscovered each season. Stone markers appeared quietly. Not monuments but small signs, arranged rocks indicating safe approaches, narrow passages between boulders cleared of debris, shallow steps carved into rock faces to ease ascent. Each modification was subtle, respectful of the land's shape. Nothing stood out sharply. Everything blended. The land was not reshaped. It was interpreted. Even danger played a role in decision-making. Certain approaches were intentionally difficult. Narrow paths that could only be traversed slowly. Steep inclines that exhausted the body. Loose gravel that betrayed hurried movement. These natural defenses required no construction, only understanding. Those who lived here learned that inconvenience could be protection. Water sources were guarded not with walls, but with discretion. Hidden wells were dug where stone met sand, where moisture lingered beneath the surface. Access points were small, easily concealed, covered with stone slabs that blended seamlessly into their surroundings. The sound of water, soft, echoing, precious, was known only to those who had learned to listen. This secrecy was not born of mistrust. It was born of necessity. In the desert, abundance invited danger. To protect a resource was to ensure survival not just for oneself, but for those who would come later. Knowledge became the strongest barrier. As seasons passed, the chosen places proved themselves. Storms raged across open plains, but wind slid harmlessly over sheltered ledges. Heat bore down relentlessly, but shaded stone offered refuge. Caravans passed nearby without noticing anything beyond rock and sand, unaware that life had begun to settle quietly within the folds of the land. At night, stars wheeled overhead, unchanged. Those who rested in these hidden places watched them with a sense of continuity. The same constellations that guided travelers now marked the passage of seasons for those who stayed. Time felt slower here, measured in cooling stone and lengthening shadows. The desert did not resist this presence. It accepted it. Because nothing about these places challenged its authority. They did not rise above the land. They sank into it. They borrowed its strength rather than opposing it. And so, without ceremony or announcement, the sites of future fortresses were chosen. Not for grandeur, not for dominance, but for quiet endurance. The walls had not yet risen, but the land had already agreed. The act of building began without ceremony. There were no proclamations, no marked beginnings. No one gathered to announce that something permanent was being created. Instead, the first stones were placed almost absent-mindedly, as if they had always belonged where they rested. A rock moved slightly to block wind. Another leaned carefully against it, not stacked, just supported. The desert watched without reaction. Stone was everywhere, yet none of it was taken lightly. Hands lifted pieces slowly, testing weight, feeling balance. Some stones were too brittle, crumbling at the edges when pressed. Others were dense and stubborn, refusing to chip or shift. These were favored, not for their size but for their reliability. The builders learned quickly that strength did not come from mass alone, but from how stone responded to time and pressure. The ground beneath their feet was warm. Sand pressed into the skin through worn sandals, reminding them of the heat held within the earth. When they knelt, grain stuck to damp palms, leaving thin trails of dust on stone surfaces. The smell of the land, dry, mineral-rich, faintly metallic, lingered in the air. It was a scent that settled deep into memory, becoming inseparable from the act of creation. No walls rose quickly. Each stone demanded consideration. Where it touched another, how weight traveled downward, whether the line it formed followed the natural shape of the land or fought against it. They learned to place stones where they wanted to rest, not where they were forced. This slowness was intentional. Rushing invited collapse. Impatience revealed itself quickly in cracks, in stones that shifted under their own weight. When something failed, it was not blamed on error. It was simply undone. The stones returned to the ground, the lesson absorbed quietly. Sunlight moved steadily across the work. Morning brought cooler air and longer shadows, ideal for lifting and shaping. By midday, the heat pressed down hard, encouraging rest rather than effort. Work paused naturally, bodies retreating into shade carved by rock faces or simple cloth shelters stretched low to the ground. Even rest was part of the process. During these pauses, eyes continued to observe how shadows lengthened, how stone surfaces changed color as they heated, how wind shifted direction without warning. These details informed the next placement, the next adjustment. When work resumed, it did so gently. Tools were simple, stones used to shape stone. Metal was rare, precious, reserved for tasks that demanded precision. Most shaping came from patience rather than force, rubbing edges smooth, tapping repeatedly until fractures followed natural lines. The rhythm was quiet, almost meditative. Tap, pause, tap again. Dust settled into hair, into folds of clothing, into the lines of hands. No one tried to brush it away. It belonged there. Over time, the builders themselves seemed to blend into the environment, figures outlined in earth tones, movements slow and deliberate, indistinguishable from the land when viewed from a distance. The earliest walls were not tall. They rose only as high as necessary, enough to break wind, to mark boundary, to support shade. Their purpose was not to intimidate. It was to endure. A low wall could be repaired easily. It could be extended gradually. It did not draw attention. Corners were softened. Sharp angles caught the wind and weakened under stress. Rounded edges resisted erosion better, allowing sand to flow around them rather than strike directly. These choices were not written anywhere. They emerged through observation, through trial, through listening to the land's response. Mortar was mixed carefully. Lime, sand, water combined slowly, tested between fingers. Too dry and it crumbled. Too wet and it weakened. The right balance held firm, binding stone without resisting its natural expansion and contraction. When pressed into place, it smelled faintly sharp, leaving residue on skin that tightened as it dried. Hands learned the feel of it. The builders could tell by touch when it was ready, when it would hold. This knowledge did not need explanation. It was carried in muscle memory, in repetition. Inside the emerging structure, space took shape quietly. Not rooms yet, just sheltered areas where heat softened and sound changed. Wind that howled outside became a muted breath within. Footsteps echoed faintly, revealing the beginnings of enclosure. Even this subtle shift affected the mind, offering a sense of grounding, of belonging. At night, the half-formed walls held warmth. Stone that absorbed the sun's heat during the day released it slowly after dark, creating pockets of comfort against the cooling air. People slept near these walls instinctively, backs against stone, feeling its steady presence through the night. Stars watched overhead unchanged. The builders did not look up often. Their focus remained on what rested beneath their hands, on the immediate task of balance and placement. Yet the rhythm of day and night shaped their work, guiding when to build, when to pause, when to reflect. There was no clear division between labor and life. Children passed stones when they were able. Elders sat nearby, observing, offering guidance through gesture or quiet correction. No one commanded. Decisions emerged through consensus, through shared understanding of what worked and what did not. Mistakes were accepted. A wall that leaned too much was dismantled carefully, stone by stone. Nothing was wasted. Each piece carried memory of placement, of adjustment. The act of undoing became as valuable as building itself, reinforcing humility and patience. Over time, the structure began to disappear into the land. From a distance, it did not stand out. Its colors matched surrounding rock. Its lines followed existing contours. Shadows fell naturally along its edges, concealing its presence during the brightest hours. This was intentional. The builders stepped back occasionally, squinting against the sun, studying how the structure appeared from afar. If it caught the eye too easily, it was adjusted. Stone shifted. Lines softened. Nothing was allowed to announce itself. Silence remained constant. The sound of construction was subdued, stone against stone, breath, the faint scrape of tools. No hammering echoed across the plains. No dust clouds rose to signal activity. The desert remained, to any observer, unchanged. Within this quiet, a sense of continuity grew. Each stone placed was not an act of defiance but of alignment. The structure did not oppose the desert. It participated in it. It acknowledged the dominance of wind, sun, and time, choosing cooperation over resistance. As days turned into months, the first enclosed spaces offered more than shelter. They offered reassurance. Not safety in the absolute sense. Nothing in the desert was truly safe, but reliability. A place where shade could be found at the same hour each day, where warmth lingered after sunset, where tools could be stored and found again. This reliability shaped behavior. People began to return to the same spot after journeys. Supplies were cached. Paths became familiar. The act of leaving no longer felt final because returning was now possible. Still, no banners were raised. No symbols marked ownership or authority. The structure existed quietly, serving those who needed it without demanding recognition. It did not challenge travelers. It did not announce refuge. It simply waited. The desert approved of this restraint. Wind flowed around the walls without protest. Sand settled gently at their base, not burying, not eroding too quickly. Time passed without incident. The first stones held, and in their stillness, they marked the true beginning, not of a fortress as the world would later know it, but of an understanding. That survival in the desert did not come from strength alone. It came from listening, from patience, from building without disturbance. The walls were not yet complete, but they were already learning how to last. Before the walls could grow higher, before rooms could multiply or stores could be gathered in confidence, there was one question that returned again and again, quietly, insistently, like the pulse beneath the desert's stillness. Where would the water come from? In the desert, stone could wait, wood could be repaired, food could be rationed and stretched thin, but water obeyed no compromise. Without it, even the strongest walls would become monuments to absence, structures that endured long after the people within them had gone. The search for water began slowly. Not with digging at first, but with listening. People watched the land during rare rains, nodding where water lingered longest after storms passed. Shallow depressions darkened briefly, damp earth holding the memory of moisture. Certain plants grew in clusters where roots had learned secrets buried deep beneath the surface. Insects gathered there too, tiny movements revealing invisible pathways below. Hands pressed into soil at dawn. Coolness clung beneath the crust of sand, subtle but unmistakable. Fingers sank slightly where moisture remained, even days after the last rainfall. These sensations were remembered carefully. No mark was left to announce them. Knowledge stayed with those who felt it. The sound of water was imagined long before it was heard. Builders worked near stone faces where fractures hinted at underground channels. Rock layers angled in ways that suggested ancient flows, water that once carved paths now hidden beneath time and sediment. The land carried these memories quietly, waiting for someone patient enough to trace them. Digging was done cautiously. Too wide an opening invited collapse. Too shallow revealed nothing. The earth resisted at first, dry and stubborn, then softened gradually as depth increased. Tools scraped and tapped, each movement measured to avoid waste of strength or water. Dust rose briefly, then settled again, leaving the air thick and still. When moisture finally appeared, it was subtle. A darkening of soil, a coolness that spread slowly beneath the fingers. The faintest scent, metallic, clean, unmistakable. Those who felt it paused, breathing deeply, allowing the moment to settle. Water was not celebrated loudly. It was acknowledged in silence. The first drops arrived reluctantly. They seeped rather than flowed, gathering slowly at the bottom of narrow shafts. The sound they made was barely audible, a soft, intermittent drip that echoed gently against stone. This sound became precious, a reminder that life could persist even here, beneath layers of sand and heat. Cisterns were carved carefully. Stone was hollowed gradually, shaped to hold rather than leak. Surfaces were smoothed to prevent seepage, sealed with mixtures refined through trial and patience. Lime, ash, and sand combined into a coating that hardened over time, growing stronger with each passing season. The builders tested constantly. Water was poured, watched, measured. Where it escaped, the flaw was corrected. Nothing was left to chance. Each cistern was treated as a living thing, fed, tended, protected. Access points were kept small. Large openings invited evaporation and contamination. Narrow shafts preserved coolness, slowing the loss of precious liquid. Stone lids were fitted precisely, blending seamlessly into surrounding rock. From above, they appeared indistinguishable from natural formations. Even those who lived nearby, sometimes forgot exactly where they were. This was intentional. Water once revealed attracted attention, and attention brought risk. In the desert, secrecy was protection. Those who needed to know were taught slowly, carefully, often through demonstration rather than instruction. A hand placed on stone, a pause, a quiet nod. The sound of water became a private companion. In the cool darkness of underground chambers, it echoed softly, drip by drip, marking time more reliably than any sun. People lingered there, resting against stone walls, letting the rhythm steady their breath. The temperature was noticeably different, cool and constant, a refuge from the relentless heat above. This space shaped thought. Conversations grew quieter here. Words felt unnecessary. The presence of water demanded respect, encouraged reflection. Even children sensed it, lowering their voices instinctively, moving carefully as if the water itself were listening. Daily routines adjusted around this resource. Water was drawn at specific times, often early morning or late evening when evaporation was minimal. Each container was filled deliberately, carried carefully, its weight felt fully. No drop was wasted casually. Washing was done sparingly. Cooking water was reused when possible. The discipline was not enforced by rule but by shared understanding. Taste mattered. Water from the cistern carried the flavor of stone, cool, faintly mineral, grounding. It reminded those who drank it of the land itself, of depth and endurance. Each sip reinforced the bond between shelter and survival. The fortress, though still incomplete, now had a heart. Stone could protect bodies, but water sustained life. With this foundation secured, confidence grew, not confidence of dominance but of continuity. People could remain longer. They could wait. Storms tested these systems. When rain finally came, water rushed through wadis with sudden violence. Builders watched from safe distance as channels filled, stones shifted, and debris surged past. When the water receded, they returned, observing where flow had been strongest, where erosion revealed weaknesses or opportunities. Rainwater was captured when possible. Channels were carved gently to guide runoff toward storage areas. Slopes were adjusted, surfaces smoothed to encourage flow. Again, these modifications blended into the land, invisible unless one knew to look. After storms, the desert smelled different. Earth released a rich, damp scent, briefly overpowering dust and heat. The air felt heavier, fuller. Life responded quickly, plants stirring, insects emerging, birds arriving to drink. These moments were brief, but they reaffirmed the importance of preparation. Water levels were monitored quietly. There were no marks carved into walls, no visible measurements. Instead, memory guided judgment. A cistern half full felt different when lifted. The sound of water changed subtly with depth. Those who drew water learned to recognize these cues instinctively. Scarcity sharpened awareness. Each drought reinforced habits of conservation. Even during periods of relative abundance, nothing changed. The desert taught that excess was temporary. Only discipline endured. The presence of water altered how the fortress functioned. Longer stays became possible. Storage increased. Animals could be kept nearby. Gardens, small and sheltered, appeared in shaded corners where soil was enriched carefully, drop by drop. Green shoots emerged hesitantly, fragile but persistent. These patches of life were tended with reverence. Hands pressed soil gently around roots. Water was delivered slowly, allowing absorption rather than runoff. The sight of green against stone and sand offered quiet reassurance, a reminder that patience could coax life even from harshness. The fortress began to feel alive. Not in grandeur, but in rhythm. Water flowed silently beneath stone. People moved with greater confidence, their routines shaped around this invisible lifeline. Even in the heat of midday, there was a sense of stability, a knowledge that survival was not immediate or fragile. At night, the sound of dripping water echoed softly beneath the stars. Those who lay against stone walls could feel the temperature difference, the gentle release of heat absorbed during the day. Sleep came easier here, steadied by the presence of water below and stone around. The desert did not change. It remained vast, indifferent, relentless. But within it, a balance had been struck. The fortress did not challenge the desert's authority. It acknowledged it, respected it, and learned to work within its rules. Water, hidden and protected, became the true foundation. Not walls, not height, not weapons, but the quiet, persistent drip beneath the earth, a reminder that endurance begins not with strength, but with sustenance. And with this foundation secured, the fortress was ready for life to unfold within its walls. Once water was secured, life began to settle into the spaces between stone. Not suddenly and never all at once. It arrived slowly, carried in routine rather than celebration. The fortress did not fill with noise or urgency. Instead, it developed a rhythm, measured, repetitive, and calm, shaped by the same patience that had guided its construction. Mornings began quietly. Before the sun rose fully above the horizon, light crept gently across stone walls, softening their rough edges. Shadows lingered in courtyards, pooling in corners where the night's coolness still held. The air was thin and crisp at this hour, carrying the faint scent of dust and stone, untouched yet by the heat to come. Footsteps echoed softly. Someone crossed the courtyard to draw water, the sound of sandals against stone steady and unhurried. A rope slid slowly through practiced hands, fibers worn smooth over time. When the bucket emerged, droplets clung briefly to its edge before falling back into darkness below. The weight of the water was familiar, grounding, carried carefully so none spilled unnecessarily. Fires were lit sparingly. Small hearths tucked against stone walls came alive with gentle crackling. Dry twigs snapped softly as flame took hold, releasing a thin ribbon of smoke that drifted upward and dispersed quickly. Cooking was simple, grains simmered slowly, releasing a warm, nutty scent that settled into the air. Salted foods were softened with care, measured precisely, each ingredient valued. The fortress awakened without announcement. Children stirred first, emerging from shaded sleeping areas where blankets lay folded neatly against walls. Their movements were quiet, instinctively respectful of the enclosed space. They traced familiar paths across courtyards, toes brushing cool stone, fingers trailing along walls that felt smooth and comforting beneath their touch. Adults followed, stretching slowly, adjusting garments, preparing for the day's work. There was no rush. Tasks were familiar and evenly distributed. Tools were gathered, simple, well-maintained, each with a designated place. Grinding stones rested near walls where shade persisted longest. Grain was poured slowly, its dry whisper filling the stillness as it spread across the surface. Hands moved rhythmically, stone against stone, a sound that blended seamlessly into the fortress's daily hum. Animals were tended nearby. Goats or sheep sheltered in enclosed corners, their presence subtle but constant. The soft shuffle of hooves, the occasional low sound of breath, added warmth to the environment. Water was offered carefully, portions controlled, watched. Even animals learned the rhythm, standing patiently, responding to familiar routines. Sunlight shifted steadily. As morning progressed, heat began to press inward. Stone walls absorbed it gradually, delaying its full impact. Those working outdoors adjusted naturally, moving deeper into shade, rotating tasks so no one remained exposed too long. The fortress guided movement without instruction, its architecture shaping behavior gently. Courtyards became places of quiet industry. Cloth was mended there, needles flashing briefly in the light before disappearing again. Pots were repaired with careful hands, cracks sealed and reinforced. Nets and ropes were inspected, fibers tightened where revealed weakness. Every act was deliberate, repetitive, and grounding. Conversation was minimal. When words were spoken, they were soft, often unnecessary. Much was communicated through gesture, through shared understanding of routine. A glance indicated readiness. A nod signaled completion. Silence was not emptiness here, it was cooperation. At midday, activity slowed. Heat settled heavily over the fortress, pressing against walls, flattening sound. This was a time for rest, not through command but instinct. People retreated into deeper shade, lying against stone that remained cooler beneath the hand. Breathing slowed. Thoughts drifted. The smell of warm stone filled the air. It was a familiar scent, dry and grounding, reminding everyone of the land beyond the walls. In these moments of stillness, reflection came easily. The mind wandered, not toward ambition or conflict, but toward small observations. The pattern of light on the wall, the rhythm of breath, the faint echo of water dripping far below. Time felt different here. Without the constant movement of travel, days stretched gently. Hours were marked not by urgency but by subtle shifts, the angle of sunlight, the cooling of air, the return of shadows to familiar corners. This predictability was comforting, a quiet promise of continuity. As the sun began to lower, activity resumed. Heat loosened its grip slowly, allowing movement to return. Fires were rekindled if needed. Food was prepared again, aromas drifting softly through enclosed spaces. The sound of grinding resumed, steady and reassuring. Evening meals were simple but shared. Bowls were passed from hand to hand, each portion modest, sufficient. The taste of food carried the effort behind it, the labor of grinding, the discipline of water use, the patience of preparation. Eating was unhurried. Each bite acknowledged survival not as victory but as maintenance. As dusk approached, the fortress transformed once more. Shadows lengthened across walls, merging into a single coolness. The air shifted, becoming lighter, easier to breathe. Sounds from beyond the walls carried faintly, wind brushing distant dunes, a bird settling somewhere unseen. Inside, lanterns were lit carefully, their glow warm and contained. The fortress held this light gently. It did not spill outward in a way that announced presence. Openings were narrow, angled, shielding glow from distant eyes. From afar, the structure remained indistinct, blending into the land even as life moved quietly within. Night routines followed familiar patterns. Water was drawn one last time. Tools were returned to their places. Animals settled. Sleeping areas were prepared with care, blankets folded neatly, bodies arranged against walls that retained warmth from the day. People lay still, listening. The sound of the fortress at night was subtle, soft breathing, an occasional shift of fabric, the distant drip of water beneath stone. Above, the sky opened wide, stars visible through narrow openings, their steady presence anchoring thought. Reflection deepened in these moments. Those within the walls thought not of war or enemies, but of endurance, of how the day had unfolded as expected, of how routines had held, of how the fortress continued to provide without demanding attention. Life within the walls was not dramatic. It was repetitive, intentional, and quiet, and in that quiet, strength accumulated slowly. The fortress was no longer just stone and water. It was a living rhythm, shaped by daily acts of care and restraint. This rhythm prepared those within for what would come. Because war, when it arrived, would test not the height of walls, but the steadiness of these routines. The desert did not change suddenly. It shifted slowly, almost politely, announcing each new season not with sharp transitions but with subtle adjustments that could be felt more than seen. Within the fortress walls, these changes were noticed first in small ways, in the texture of air against skin, in how stone responded to sunlight, in how long shadows lingered before retreating. Summer arrived quietly. Days stretched longer and the sun climbed higher, pressing its weight downward with steady insistence. Outside the walls, the desert seemed to flatten under the heat, dunes losing contrast as light erased detail. Inside, the fortress responded as it had been shaped to do. Thick stone walls absorbed warmth gradually, delaying the full force of the day's heat until hours had passed. By morning, the interior still held the night's coolness. Hands brushing against walls felt a faint chill beneath the surface. Floors remained comfortable to sit upon. People moved deliberately, using this borrowed time wisely, drawing water, preparing food, completing tasks that required energy before the heat fully settled in. As the day progressed, warmth crept inward. It did not rush. It seeped slowly through stone, a gentle reminder of the world beyond the walls. By midday, the air inside felt heavier, encouraging rest. Courtyards became still, activity retreating into deeper shade. This rhythm was understood instinctively. No one fought it. The fortress had learned how to breathe with the heat. Openings were narrow and carefully angled, allowing air to move without inviting sun. Breezes slid through passageways, cooled by stone before reaching interior spaces. In some corners, air moved so gently it was barely noticeable, just enough to stir fabric, to cool skin faintly, to remind the body that movement still existed. Water use changed with the season. Drawn earlier in the morning, stored carefully, consumed more slowly. Skin was wiped rather than washed. Cloth was shaken clean rather than rinsed. Discipline sharpened, not through fear, but through memory of past summers when scarcity had tested patience. Nights offered relief. As the sun fell, stone released the heat it had gathered throughout the day. Warmth radiated softly into sleeping spaces, preventing the sharp chill that could follow sunset in the open desert. People rested against walls, feeling this gradual release, their breathing synchronizing with the fortress's quiet exchange of energy. Stars returned each night unchanged. They marked the passing of time more reliably than any calendar. Certain constellations rose earlier or later, hinting at the slow march of seasons. Those who watched them learned when the heat would begin to ease, when winds would shift, when change was approaching. Autumn softened the desert. The sun's intensity weakened, though its presence remained constant. Days shortened subtly. Evenings cooled more quickly. Winds returned with gentler persistence, brushing against stone surfaces, carrying fine dust that settled quietly at the fortress's base. With this shift came movement. Tasks extended later into the day. Repairs were undertaken more frequently, cracks sealed, worn surfaces smoothed. The fortress was maintained not because it was failing, but because care itself was a form of survival. Rain, when it came, was brief. Clouds gathered without warning, darkening the sky suddenly. The scent of damp earth rose before the first drops fell, sharp and unmistakable. Water struck stone with soft taps, then quickened, flowing along carved channels, disappearing into cisterns below. People watched without celebration. They trusted the systems they had built. Rain was welcomed, but never assumed. When it ended, as it always did, the desert returned to its quiet state, leaving only darker patches of earth and the faint echo of water moving beneath stone. Winter arrived gently. Nights grew colder, air thinned, sharpening breath. The desert revealed a different face, one not of heat but of stillness. Frost sometimes formed in shallow shadows before dawn, melting quickly when touched by the first light. The fortress held warmth well. Stone walls, once a defense against heat, now became protection against cold. Fires burned slightly longer at night, their glow steady and contained. People slept closer together, bodies forming their own shelter within the stone enclosure. Food tasted different in winter. Stored grains and dried provisions carried deeper significance. Each meal reflected foresight, the quiet labor of preparation months earlier. Eating was slower, more deliberate, accompanied by longer pauses and shared stillness. Wind behaved differently now. It moved lower, sharper, threading through open spaces with intent. The fortress responded with stillness, doors secured, openings adjusted. Sound carried differently, sharper in the cold air. Footsteps echoed longer. Even voices seemed to linger. Through all this, the walls remained unchanged. They did not crack or shift dramatically. Their design allowed them to expand and contract with temperature, to endure without strain. The fortress did not resist the seasons. It accepted them. Spring returned gradually. The desert stirred almost imperceptibly. A faint green appeared in sheltered corners. Insects emerged cautiously. Birds returned, tracing familiar paths across the sky. Air warmed without urgency, inviting movement once more. Within the walls, routines adjusted again. Tasks expanded outward. Repairs continued. Small gardens were refreshed carefully, watered sparingly. Life resumed its steady cycle, shaped not by command but by environment. The seasons passed, and with each cycle the fortress proved its quiet intelligence. It did not dominate the desert. It listened to it. It allowed heat, cold, wind, and rain to pass through without damage. This endurance became a form of reassurance. Those who lived within the walls understood now that survival was not static. It was responsive. It required attention, memory, and patience. The fortress did not stand against time. It stood with it. And in learning this, it prepared itself, and those within, for the first distant signs of conflict that would soon test not its strength, but its steadiness. The desert, as it always had, remained patient. It watched without judgment. It had seen empires rise and crumble into sand, had seen caravans vanish under storms, had listened to whispers carried on wind that stretched for miles. But the fortress, the quiet heart of human perseverance, had grown attuned to subtler signals, those that the desert itself almost seemed to withhold. The first signs of tension did not announce themselves with drums or banners. There was no clash of armies, no thunder of hooves. They came instead as minor disturbances, almost imperceptible, felt rather than understood. A patrol returned late. A supply caravan was delayed, its return postponed by a dust storm that seemed unusually fierce. There were rumors whispered at twilight, voices that lingered in the corridors long after they had been spoken. The fortress responded the way it always had to change, slowly, deliberately, with observation before action. Leaders and guards moved through familiar routines but with an added layer of awareness. Eyes lingered on the horizon longer, on the dunes and distant hills that had once been neutral witnesses. Horses stamped more nervously in their stalls. Dogs, usually calm in the heat of day, growled softly, following shadows that shifted too quickly. Inside, life continued its rhythmic adjustments. The heat of summer, the cool of winter, they were predictable. This was not. The uncertainty was a new season of its own. People spoke in hushed tones. Messengers arrived carrying fragmented news from outlying settlements. No attacks yet, one reported, but movements have been seen. Another brought grain counts, water measurements, all meticulously noted. It was not panic but preparation, a gathering of knowledge and resources for a threat that was real, yet not immediate. Food storage changed subtly. Rations were recalculated. Surplus was distributed to those who could carry it further or guard it more securely. Water, always precious, was monitored with increased vigilance. Every cistern, every hidden channel, every small reservoir within the walls became a point of strategic importance. Nothing new had been built, but everything was assessed anew. The fortress itself seemed to understand. Walls, which had always absorbed heat and cold, now took on a symbolic weight. Narrow corridors became pathways of observation, towers, vantage points of quiet watchfulness. Arrow slits, once simply for defense against raiders or opportunistic bandits, were studied for angles, distances, lines of sight. Even the familiar rhythm of footsteps through stone halls seemed to change, adopting a cadence that was alert without urgency. The desert responded in kind. Sand, usually patient in its drift, shifted more aggressively under wind. The dunes changed shape overnight, erasing familiar tracks, revealing others. Dust storms formed with unusual timing, masking paths and movement. Birds, once predictable in migration, altered their course. The fortress watchers noticed these patterns, cataloging them, understanding that the land itself was a participant in the coming events. Rumors became strategy. Small debates arose among the council, not of fear but of logistics. "We must be prepared for siege," one said. "But supplies are sufficient for how long?" Another suggested alternative routes for caravans, paths that avoided open desert where scouts or raiders could spot them. Each idea was considered carefully, weighed against memory of past summers, winters, rains, and storms. Decisions were not rash. They were deliberate, a mirror of the fortress's own patient endurance. The first skirmishes arrived as they always do, quietly. Not with fanfare, but with subtle shifts. A distant signal fire caught attention one evening, small and flickering against the horizon. Patrols returned with minor injuries, skirmishes against unknown groups who vanished before they could be fully engaged. The fortress absorbed these shocks with the same care it had once absorbed the extremes of weather. Its residents adjusted, not in panic, but in the precise modulation of effort and vigilance. Lessons from the past guided them. They had survived sandstorms that buried outer walls, droughts that threatened to empty cisterns, and winters that froze their water before it could reach kitchens. Each experience had reinforced a philosophy of observation, endurance, and anticipation. The first skirmishes were dangerous, yes, but they were also a test of patience, of learned adaptability. The desert seemed to conspire in silence. It hid paths, revealed weaknesses, offered subtle warnings in shifts of wind and sand. A rider returning from patrol might notice a dune edge that was too sharp, a shadow that fell oddly against stone. These were small signals, easily missed by those untrained, but crucial to those who understood. The fortress itself seemed to accentuate these signals, amplifying the whispers of the desert through its corridors and towers. Night brought particular clarity. The cold air sharpened senses. Sounds carried further and shadows lengthened with purpose. Watchmen leaned into stone walls, listening for disturbances in the distance. Fires were kept low, not to draw attention but to provide a comforting glow against the dark, empty desert. Every movement became deliberate, every breath a part of rhythm and routine. Within the walls, people discovered the value of shared vigilance. Conversations were shorter, more deliberate. Children were instructed not in fear but in awareness, how to move quietly, how to observe without being seen. Artisans adjusted schedules to avoid exposure during patrols or skirmishes, finding balance between productivity and precaution. It was a subtle choreography, performed without fanfare, in the quiet spaces of stone and sand. Supply lines became lessons in subtlety. Caravans that once carried goods openly were now shielded by tents, camouflaged against the dunes. Travel was synchronized with natural patterns, winds, sun position, shadow movement, turning ordinary logistical work into an exercise in strategic timing. Each person who passed through the gates understood not only their immediate task, but also their part in a larger, delicate system. The fortress continued to teach patience. Its walls, once simply enduring, now seemed to communicate, move with awareness, anticipate change, respect the desert and its rhythms. Residents learned that strength was not merely in stones or weapons, but in observation and restraint. A single misstep in haste could be more dangerous than any external attack. And yet life did not halt. Inside the walls, life adapted rather than froze. Gardens continued in small, controlled spaces. Water channels were redirected with care, not panic. Bread was baked, pottery shaped, garments repaired. Even amid the rising threat of conflict, the fortress maintained its quiet, deliberate pace, a steady heartbeat that resisted the chaos beyond. The desert, too, observed these preparations. Its dunes shifted, not in mockery but in alignment with the lessons of survival. Sand that had once been neutral became a guide, highlighting vulnerabilities, suggesting routes, and quietly testing responses. The fortress, in turn, respected these subtle cues, integrating them into its ongoing routine. By the end of this early period, the people of the fortress understood something new. Strength was not always measured in walls or weapons. Sometimes it was measured in endurance, in patience, in the ability to interpret silence and shadow. The desert, ever impartial, had given its first true test, not of force, but of quiet, unhurried wisdom. And the fortress, as always, listened. It prepared itself not with fear, but with the same calm intelligence that had guided it through decades, through seasons, through the invisible cycles of heat and cold, wind and rain. If war was coming, it would be met not only with stone and strategy, but with experience honed over countless quiet years. The first murmur of conflict had arrived. And within the fortress, the air was thick not with panic, but with understanding. Survival, like the desert, required patience, attention, and the willingness to move with time itself, rather than against it. The desert had witnessed centuries of human endeavor. Entire kingdoms had risen on its edges, only to vanish like mirages, their histories swallowed by wind and sand. The fortress, however, remained, quiet, patient, enduring. Its walls bore the memory of every season, every heat wave, every frost, every dust storm that had tested those who lived within. By now the skirmishes had faded. Threats had come and gone, as all things do, leaving behind traces rather than scars. The people had adapted. They understood the rhythms of both the desert and life itself. Survival had become a craft, learned slowly, honed through observation and discipline, tempered by patience. Inside the walls, daily life continued as it always had. Stone corridors absorbed sunlight and released warmth with familiar precision. Water flowed through channels measured and conserved. Bread was baked. Children played quietly in sheltered courtyards. Artisans repaired what had worn thin. Even in calm, the fortress moved with purpose, a rhythm tuned to both nature and the human spirit. The first signs of spring returned to the desert. Tender green shoots emerged in shaded corners. Birds traced arcs across the sky. Breezes carried warmth without urgency. The fortress welcomed these small shifts with silent acknowledgement. It had learned that endurance was not a matter of resistance, but of cooperation, of listening, responding, and moving in harmony with forces larger than oneself. From the towers one could see the dunes stretching endlessly. They seemed immutable, yet they shifted imperceptibly with time, just as the fortress had. Stone and sand, human effort and natural patience, intertwined in a quiet understanding. That permanence was an illusion, but endurance was real. Those who had lived within the walls reflected often on what they had witnessed. Wars came and left, seasons cycled endlessly, yet the fortress continued. It was more than architecture. It was memory made manifest, patience embodied, intelligence in stone. It did not defy time, it absorbed it, using it to grow steadier, wiser, and more resilient. And so, as night fell over the desert, stars appearing in their familiar constellations, the fortress stood quietly. Fires glowed softly, people rested, and the wind whispered across walls that had endured more than any of its inhabitants could ever measure. The desert's challenges had come and gone. Human threats had come and faded. Yet the fortress remained, not triumphant, not defiant, but serene. It had endured because it had learned to move with the world rather than against it, to listen rather than demand, to trust both memory and patience. In the silence, one truth echoed clearly. Survival is not in domination but in harmony, not in haste but in careful observation, not in fear but in steadfast endurance. The fortress would continue. Seasons would cycle, sands would shift, and time would pass. But here, in this quiet bastion of stone, life had learned to endure. It was the desert's lesson, written in walls and footsteps, carried in whispers, and remembered by those who had lived long enough to see it unfold. The fortress had not merely survived, it had learned to endure beyond time.